Are they? This is another one of those cataloguing or putting things into categories videos that I like to do. Um, I've identified 6 different categories of consciousness. And the reason I've done this is really because I think it kind of helps um, your awareness to know which category of consciousness you're currently occupying. But in actual fact, it's at least 2 different categories of consciousness that you will be experiencing at any one time. At least I think so anyway. And I'll come back to that in a bit. So just briefly to go through them. Observational consciousness. This is the sort of creme de la creme of consciousness. This is the bird watching the other bird eating. And the bird that's watching the other bird eating is your observational consciousness. And that consciousness connects you directly and indirectly to soul awareness. And from there to God consciousness and God awareness. And metaphysically, it connects you to the transcendental realm of the true God. To undertake or to cultivate observational consciousness is obviously the objective of the Gnostic way of life, or the Gnostic rule. So meditation, the contemplative life, is obviously very important to Gnostics generally, and always has been. You observe, for example, your breath. It could be something as simple as that, making the out breath slightly longer than the in breath, and becoming aware of the movement of your lungs, the movement of your thoracic cavity, of your thoracic muscles, the movement of air. Warm air being drawn in and cold, warm air going out and cold air being drawn in, or it could be the other way around, I suppose. It depends. Anyway, it's all relative. Observational consciousness, as I said, is what really goes with self-insight and self-knowledge and self-awareness. These are the things that result from a cultivation of observational consciousness. On the other hand, I got here what they call no consciousness. And that is when all awareness is blotted out. Consciousness itself is blotted out. It can be drug-induced, of course, but that has a negative connotation where you would, you're taking drugs to escape your consciousness and to blot out your mental ruminations over the day. But on a positive sense, it's also trance-induced and orgiastically induced as well. So during orgasm, the mind is blotted out, which has been obviously observed. It's kind of how the man on the Clapham omnibus, and the woman, as for that matter, achieves a sort of faux state of soul awareness, however briefly. Now, trances are a bit more involved. They usually arise out of certain practices and ritual practices, and of course, anything repeated long enough, any exercises repeated long enough, including breath awareness, will induce a trance-like quality, where basically everything that you are is blotted out, and you get out of the way of yourself, as it were. And then certain things can happen, certain changes in consciousness can happen, which are said to connect you to the spiritual. So there's a positive and there's a negative side to non-consciousness achievement, and that's why it's to be treated with very great respect, and not at all abused, which it can be by a lot of people and is abused by a lot of people. And of course, so that's one thing. Now, the reactive consciousness I put onto the earth side of things. It's where basically, as the Buddhists observe, we have a reactive consciousness. Whenever a stimulus comes into our perception, we react in many different ways, and I've listed some of the important ways here, like yuck, hope, help, positive and negative reactions. And I just observed, interestingly enough, during a meditation session, that in fact, you know, your observational consciousness is completely blotted out whenever you hear something, like you hear a sound outside, and your brain goes what, or it goes nice, or it goes yuck, or it goes want, I want it, or oh, as a sort of a shock, or help. But normally you sort of yuck or want. And this is how most people's consciousness, including mine, operates during the day in a reactive way. And you can observe, of course, your reactions during the day and note them down, either mentally or even physically, which is an interesting thing to do. Directive consciousness, as I attributed to air, this is where you analyze problems, you come up with plans, life plans, short, medium, and long term plans. And of course, fragile, because the best laid plans of mice and men, and also life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. And as John Lennon said, so all this kind of thing enters into directive plans. Are useful, and we ruminate over them, and we make plans for the future, and we try and direct the energy of the universe to our advantage. And so different types of magic come into here, and sorcery and all this kind of stuff. And people sit down and make a plan. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, a very positive thing to do, in fact. Well, it mostly is anyway. But of course, it can lead to frustration of plans. It can lead to obsession, which is a problem with sorcery. And so, again, a positive and negative arises out of directive consciousness. And also wanting the world to be as you would like it, not actually how it is, which leads to a multitude of different psychological responses, and of course leads you back, I suppose, to the reactive consciousness, when you say help or what or yuck or nice or want, as a result of cultivating directive consciousness, which I mean we do as human beings. And this leads to, well, this is a positive thing, total consciousness. I have in mind here the kind of consciousness. It's a bit like trance. For example, if you're playing the piano or the guitar, you're practicing, or you're playing, and you're really getting into the zone. Or you're playing a computer game, and your whole mind is focused on the tasks at hand. Micro decisions, micro movements of your hands and fingers, and body posture, and if you're doing gymnastics. So total consciousness comes into here. And again, a lot of people like to do gymnastics and sports of various kinds because, a bit like orgasm, and a bit like drugs and certain trances, you're in the zone, you're sort of blotted out. But whereas non-consciousness is usually induced, sort of as a result of something that you're doing to yourself or something that is being done to you, total consciousness arises out of something that you're doing. You're the actor, you're the doing person. So you're doing the piano practice, or playing some piece of music, which requires all your concentration, or you're doing some gymnastics or sports. And this total concentration is arising out of your mind being completely happy and completely in control, and completely focused and naturally sort of, I don't know, caught up in the moment, as it were, of either success. But of course, total consciousness doesn't guarantee success, and so therefore you can, as I say, go from there to reactive consciousness. When you miss the ball. And you go, damn it. And that's a reaction to your total consciousness not being sufficient to complete the job, which is to hit the ball right. So that's my sort of separate category, and some may argue that's almost really the same as non-consciousness, when you yourself get out of your own way, out of your own shadow, and are able to do things which other people that can't do them find remarkable or even miraculous. And then finally, I've got a category here called explorative consciousness. I have in mind here, this is when people take tea leaves or tarot cards or the I Ching, and they discover information about their subconscious or unconscious, or deep psychology, which they didn't know before. Because normally what happens is that all access to deep consciousness is denied, and it takes some kind of projection, some kind of external projection, say onto the tarot cards, to reveal the contents. And so I call it explorative consciousness, because you're actually using the tarot, for example, as a way of exploring the consciousness that is normally denied to you, normally you don't have access to consciously. But I've also covered here dreams as well. But obviously, trance can enter into this as well. You can find out things in your subconscious by means of trance and orgasm and magic rituals and things like that, and other exercises. So explorative consciousness can be produced as a result of non-consciousness, as a result of trance, or a blotting out of the normal consciousness. So this brings me on to the fact that at least most of the time, you have two categories of consciousness operating, and as I say, and you think of it as a clock face. These are sort of various times, as we might say, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and 8 o'clock, something like that. Yeah, and at various times, and think of it like as hands of the clock going round. At the moment, the big hand is pointing to the 12, and the little hand is pointing to the 2. It's 2 o'clock. So basically, you are aware, for example, of the exploration of your deep consciousness. So the tarot cards are making you aware of things within yourself, for example. So that's a kind of example of observational consciousness plus explorative consciousness, for example. But then, of course, as the clock goes round the face, all these types of categories of consciousness, of course, fuzz together. There's already fuzzy edges between these categories, as there are always between categories. And as you go through the day, there's going to be at least 2 different types of consciousness arising, or perhaps 3 even. And I've already sort of looked at those briefly. Certainly reactive consciousness could be, you could think of that as the second hand, the hand for seconds. And that's going around faster than the other two, because indeed we are reacting to everything that is going on to our consciousness, including observational consciousness, which is why it's very difficult to do meditation, because in fact you react to the observational consciousness, thereby creating reactive consciousness, which undermines your observational power, which is why meditation is so difficult. So if nothing else, these categories can explain, why meditation is so difficult, and why it's very, very difficult to observe yourself thinking, as it were. You might be able to blot out most of your consciousness through meditation. You might be able to stop directive consciousness, You might be able to stop. Certainly you stop rumination and quite a lot of your reactivity, as it were, but not all. And then again, some meditations we can have exploratory consciousness arising. Obviously, there's total consciousness there, with a bit of non-consciousness. But certainly, you can certainly get rid of these two or reduce these two, but not entirely. And I think, but the point about it, though, finally, is that you can certainly observe yourself going through all these other consciousness types. You can observe yourself ruminating over the future. You can observe yourself reacting to things emotionally. You can observe yourself, things coming from your subconscious, and you have great ideas. Suddenly they come from nowhere, apparently. You can go into total consciousness, and then you can go into a sort of comfortable numbness, comfortably numb, as Pink Floyd would say. Dark Side, no, I wish we're here, comfortably numb. Where you sort of, maybe you're half asleep, and you're sort of you're kind of in a non-consciousness kind of state, but you're also dreaming. So that can be explorative consciousness is arising from your zoned out state as you awake from sleep, for example. So you can possibly observe that process happening as well, without reacting emotionally to it. So the idea of observational reactions, observational consciousness, is that it is mostly positive. In fact, it's all positive. It's all spontaneous, and it all leads to great insight. Whereas the other types of consciousness have a negative and a positive side. And for example, explorative consciousness, well, you can get obsessed with that as well. You can get obsessed with the I Ching, for example, and with tarot and everything, and and you become more and more introverted, which is no good at all. So, in an attempt, I suppose, to escape from your reactive consciousness, where you're seeing, because you're depressed about something, you're seeing yuck and help, and reacting to everything in life like yuck. So in order to escape, you're either to escape into drugs or into some kind of obsession with tarot or something like that, or even obsession with sports too. Some people try and escape their consciousness by doing nothing but sport all the time, and you often wonder about sports people, whether that's really why they're doing sports, is in order to reach total consciousness, and perhaps from that to non-consciousness, as a result of obsessively doing sports, and thinking about nothing but achievement all the time, and of course then, they'd be doing directive consciousness and be coming into it because they're planning their their training program, and obsessing about over that, but treating their bodies like a sort of game plan, as it were, and to as a means to an end, and the end, of course, is the gold medal or whatever. Obviously, the relationship between these types of consciousness is incredibly complicated. It changes every day, of course, due to circumstances. Surely it's a good idea to reduce reactive consciousness and directive consciousness as much as it possibly can. Sometimes it's good to go into explorative consciousness to find out what makes you tick over certain periods of your life. Total consciousness is good. Is a powerful release of willpower, free flowing will. And non-consciousness, well, I mean, that also is beautiful. It's a beautiful thing to experience. But certainly, observational consciousness is certainly the category that is most useful as far as your soul is concerned, because the idea is here that the soul is incarnate in body, to use a sort of theosophical concept. Buddhist concept, in order to gain experience, in order to observe the world and to observe how our different parts of consciousness work and react and make of situations and make their own situations for that matter as well. So things coming into you and also things coming out of you, as it were, and you're observing basically the two processes, as it were, the two movements of energy, as it were, mental energy. So anyway, I don't know whether this has been useful to you to understand this. I think it sometimes helps to understand, certainly to understand if you're reacting, if you're in reactive consciousness, so you're in yuck mode, or you're in what mode, or you're in help mode. And sometimes I think it's important to say, oh, look, I'm being very directive today, ruminating too much. And sometimes you think, well, I'm doing too much tea leaf prediction. And sometimes you can think I'm doing too much hankering after total consciousness. And I'm also trying to escape something in my consciousness by going into non-consciousness. And that's kind of a good thing to actually understand. So you're becoming unbalanced in a way, because obviously these types of consciousness, as well as being sort of smoothing and transition, sort of fuzzing into each other, they also have to be held in balance with each other as well. Well, certainly the five here, an observational consciousness actually allows you to achieve a dynamic equilibrium between these other types of consciousness. So it's all good, really, and don't worry about it.